They are in clouds, more than 1,000 feet below the surrounding terrain's height. And they have no idea that they are going directly to observe a mountain. Keep an eye out. Tuesday, November 10, 2016. The two pilots involved were meant to be on standby duty today, but late in the afternoon on November 9, the Wizz Air Operations Controller called them and told them that they would have to conduct 4 flights the next day. The initial trip was scheduled to be a positioning flight, sometimes known as a ferry flight, from Budapest, Hungary, to Nice, Serbia. Sometimes, for operational or technical reasons, an aircraft must be transported from one airport to another, necessitating these types of ferry flights. This means that the pilots would place the aircraft without any passengers, sometimes with the help of their cabin crew, and this frequently results in a more laid-back environment aboard. Because it's always interesting to try something a little unusual, the pilots probably looked forward to this maiden flight when they finally arrived at their crew room in Budapest on November 13. Since neither of them had ever flown to this airport, they likely took a closer look at the arrival and approach map when they first started reading the pre-flight materials. They also likely glanced at the general weather and no thumbs. However, everything appeared to be rather simple. They simply moved over to brief their 4 cabin crew colleagues, who were probably also anticipating a fairly laid-back start to their day, after they were satisfied with the preparation. The pilots decided that the captain would be pilot monitoring and the first officer would be pilot flying for this first ferry flight leg, as they all headed out to the sleek Airbus A300 and 2200. That's the concept anyway. Naturally, there may be instances in which the captain must pilot the aircraft, particularly if the runway is short or there are other operational constraints. However, despite the approach appearing rather challenging, this was not the case in this instance. As soon as they got into the cockpit, the captain made sure everything was in working order and that there were no open technical problems. He immediately hurried outside to begin the walk around while the first officer set up the cockpit. We don't really know for sure, but it's not uncommon on positioning flights because it allows the cabin crew to enjoy the views from the flight deck and gain a better understanding of the workload that the pilots are dealing with during various flight phases. As he was doing this, one of the flight attendants asked if she could stay in the cockpit for the flight, and the pilot agreed. These days, it is largely concealed behind the shut cockpit door. Though it can sometimes create an environment that can get a little too relaxed and, if not managed properly, lead to diversions, it's also wonderful for us pilots to have the opportunity to chat with our cabin crew colleagues for a little while, something that short-haul pilots rarely get to do these days. In that case, who were the pilots on this flight? The 62-year-old captain has a wealth of expertise. In all, he has flown more than 22,000 hours, including around 5,500 on the Airbus A320 series. He claimed that although he felt well on this particular day, he was a touch worn out from not getting enough good sleep the night before. With about 5,000 hours of total time and just over 2,000 hours on the Airbus A320 and A321, his 49-year-old co-pilot was likewise comparatively experienced. Returned from a period of yearly leave and had not taken any flights in the 10 days prior. However, he was in excellent health, and perhaps this, together with the fact that he felt well rested, was another factor in his decision to fly the first leg. Regardless, the pilots proceeded to configure the aircraft in accordance with their usual protocols. Following the completion of the departure briefing, the first officer would have instructed a member of the cabin crew on how to utilize the jump seat, oxygen mask, and headset, a procedure that must be followed each time a passenger is using a jump seat. Following everyone's readiness, the first officer requested pushback and startup clearance. After receiving these, we witnessed Flight 801 pushback, start its engines, and soon begin its journey towards the runway. As the plane continued to taxi out, everything was going according to plan, and they soon lined up on the runway and were given the all-clear to take off. The aircraft subsequently began to accelerate and continued for a standard takeoff after the first officer set the takeoff thrust. We're now heading for Nice, ascending like a rocket because the plane was so light without any passengers. The target that these pilots were now flying towards deserves a little more explanation before we continue. The Great Airport, Serbia's second biggest airport, is always pleasant. It is located on the border between Serbia and Bulgaria in the southern portion of the nation, close to the Stara Planina, also known as the Old Mountains, which are a part of the western end of the Balkan mountain range. The extremely high topography surrounding the airport, which is actually located in a sort of valley, is one of the main risks at Nice. Even though the runway is only 650 feet high, it is encircled by extremely high terrain on almost all sides, with minimum sector altitude MSAs as high as 7,000 feet. One of the things that pilots must always be mindful of is the MSAs, which are altitudes that are indicated on our navigational chart and always provide a minimum terrain clearance of 1,000 feet. You can, of course, drop below the MSA if you're on an instrument flight plan, which all large aircraft are, but only if you're adhering to a pre-approved track or procedure. Accurate track keeping was also crucial because of the mountainous terrain surrounding this airport. It's important to remember that all arrivals and misapproach operations into Nice were prepared with stringent height limits as a result. If, for instance, the aircraft approaches the ground too closely with the landing gear in the wrong position or the flap configuration is not adjusted appropriately, it can alert the crew with a variety of warnings and cautions. It can also do the same if the aircraft's sink rate on approach is too high or if it doesn't achieve a positive climb after takeoff. The EGPWS system can also offer terrain information in addition to alerts. This information can be chosen to overlay the navigation display and provide a visual representation of the ground surrounding the aircraft. In that configuration, it color coordinates the terrain so that everything below the aeroplane is shown as green, or if it is very far below, black. Low-density yellow blocks are used for anything between that level and 1,000 feet above. High-density yellow blocks are used for anything above that, and red is used for territory over 2,000 feet above. Since the weather radar and the terrain display cannot be presented on the same screen at the same time, the pilots have to decide which to show. It's always a good idea for one pilot to have a topographical display and the other to have weather radar when operating in high-lying places, like this airport. The Honeywell EGPWS that Airbus employs has 6 distinct modes that are important being aware of: excessive descent rate, excessive terrain closing rate, altitude loss following takeoff or go around, dangerous terrain clearance while not in landing configuration, and excessive departure below the glide slope are all grounds for caution and alerts in the first 5 modes. Additionally, the 6th option only offers warning indicators like minimums and bank angles. However, mode number 2, excessive terrain closure rate, will be the one that becomes most fascinating in this narrative. This mode contains alerts such as terrestrial, which if the aircraft is within warning range, switch to pull-up warnings. And here's where the upgraded system we're discussing here differs from the outdated GPWS that the crew in the Cali accident had. You see, the improved system has a considerably longer alerting period because it can anticipate a conflict and look ahead in addition to responding to the terrain. It accomplishes this by displaying ribbons in front of the aircraft that indicate its present trajectory and speed, as well as where it will be in the next several minutes. After comparing this progress prediction with its terrain database, it begins to sound a warning if the prediction indicates that the ribbons run the risk of running in the terrain. The pull-up warning usually sounds about 30 seconds prior to contact, and the caution alert usually sounds when the aircraft is estimated to be 40 to 60 seconds distant. Even if 30 seconds isn't much time, if the right answers are given, it should be sufficient because it's based on a predictive function that looks forward. The crew now relaxed a little after the plane had reached its cruising altitude. After completing their paperwork, it's reasonable to presume that the environment aboard was pleasant and laid back, perhaps because the cockpit door was open and more cabin personnel were entering than were departing. However, with the anticipated terrain concerns still vivid in their minds, the crew began to focus and get ready for their arrival as the aircraft finally began to reach the top of the sand. Since neither pilot had ever flown into this airport before, it was especially crucial to conduct a comprehensive brief. The crew chose to set up the arrival and approach specified on their flight plan, the Sorsec 1 Romeo Alpha arrival, since they had no prior knowledge of the airport or the clearances traffic control might grant them. They also checked the weather and discovered that runway 11 was being used with a VOR approach. The crew of the Airbus A320 can now program the route, as well as details like the planned arrival and approach procedure, using the Flight Management Computer, or FNC. From the approach drop-down menu, the crew here simply added the VOR 11 approach after choosing the Sorsec 1 Romeo Alpha arrival. Additionally, the FNC offers the choice of choosing a via point or transition. They probably would have chosen the November India Sierra Navite as well, since it was the last stop before switching to the procedural VOR approach for the Sorsec 1 Romeo Alpha. The Compact Display Unit, or CDU, now displays all pertinent speeds and altitude limits that are coded into the FNC programmed arrivals and approaches. In this instance, for instance, it had to be at or above 4,300 feet until it passed rebar, a LAMOV, and an NA known as the Juliet Sierra Tango. Additionally, their navigation displays would have displayed this information once it was selected. After setting everything up, the pilots talked about some possible risks to the approach, such as the steeper than normal VOR glide path, which might require them to configure earlier to reduce speed, and the fact that this was a non-precision approach. This invariably calls for increased focus, dedication, and protocol adherence. Incorporating possible dangers into the briefing is a relatively new idea, because it has been discovered that many mistakes can be prevented and crews become more resilient overall by visualizing and devising plans for handling expected dangers. This is comparable, but on a much larger scale, to preparing for heavy traffic and leaving your house early for work. In this instance, the VR approach into runway 11 also included a procedural turn, which began at November India Sierra VR and proceeded via LAMO to RIBAR and Juliet Sierra Tango, the final approach position. The crew would have been forced to fly through this entire process due to the arrival of the Sorsec 1 Romeo Alpha, but there was really a superior arrival option that would have put them in a straight line for a straight-in approach to RIBAR and Juliet Sierra Tango. Although this method was known as Sorsec 2 Alpha, the crew chose to follow whatever was in their flight plan because they were not familiar with the airport. It is vital to note that the Juliet Sierra Tango transition will soon become significant. On that arrival, there was also a transition between the Juliet Sierra Tango and the B beacon to allow entry into the VR approach from other directions as well. The crew probably didn't spend a lot of time observing the various arrivals though, because as I previously stated, there were other risks associated with this approach. For example, the approach was steeper than usual, and the runway direction was 109 degrees, which was 6 degrees off from the inbound course of 115 degrees. Although that might not seem like much, it would have meant that they would have had to conduct some late-stage maneuvering because the runway would not have been immediately in front of them when they became visible. As a result, the pilot talked on how they planned to fly all of this, including how and when to slow down and set up the aircraft. The weather was suitable for the approach and the final visual they anticipated. However, that begs the question, what kind of weather was it? The situation was slightly different higher up, even if the ground conditions were generally favorable, with only mild and changeable winds, a QNH of 1013, and a temperature of 6 degrees Celsius. It's also important to keep in mind that the crew would be flying virtually totally inside the cloud during the descent, prohibiting any visual orientation at all, due to the multiple layers of clouds at altitude that would block the view of the terrain. In any case, The area controller quickly gave the crew the all-clear to begin descending towards their objective, and they soon came close to Sorsik, where their arrival procedure began. However, the controller abruptly summoned them up when they were nearly past that point, allowing them to track the approach of the Sorsik 2 Alpha rather than the Sorsik 1 Romeo Alpha. However, as I previously stated, this was not the routing that they had really briefed, even if it was a preferable one for the mobile job. Multiple arrivals starting from the same location and heading to the same runway are not unusual. If you have already programmed and briefed one arrival and are suddenly cleared for another, you can always try to make your life easier by asking a controller if you can fly the one you have planned for. They might even approve it. This is because different ones can then be used depending on which nav aids are working or for traffic separation purposes. However, since the routing and altitude restrictions can differ greatly, it is crucial that the pilots input the new arrival into the flight management computer, check it carefully, and then brief it again if that is not feasible or, as in this instance, would result in a much longer route. However, the crew in this instance appeared to be a little rushed, so they simply put the new arrival into the FNC and carried it out without fully briefing it. And that was despite the fact that they had plenty of time to do so by now. As I previously indicated, if they had examined it, they would have seen that the only segment to Alpha would, for the approach, bring the aircraft in on a more direct route across rebar and then towards the Ulight Sierra Tango NDV. However, do you recall the Ulight Sierra Tango transition I mentioned earlier? A procedural turn from Uliat Sierra Tango to a point known as NIS 308 rebar and back was made possible by this transition. However, there was no reason to fly that given the direction that aircraft 801 was already approaching. They could move right in for the approach because they were already heading straight towards Uliat Sierra Tango from rebar. However, that procedural turn remained a possibility, and when the pilots swiftly entered this new arrival, chose the Juliet Sierra Tango approach again, and then executed it, it remained in place. The issue would have been resolved if they had chosen the no via option instead. Do you recall? Trash in, trash out. All aircraft had to stay at least 4,300 feet in the air until they reached Juliet Sierra Tango. This was done both from the rebar direction and, if arriving from the opposite direction, for the Juliet Sierra Tango procedure turn. On the 115-degree final inbound route towards the VR, after passing Juliet Sierra Tango, was the earliest time anyone was able to drop from 4,300 feet. That will be crucial in the near future. After passing the rebar, the pilots should have set the platform altitude for the VR approach at 4,300 feet, having continued to descend in accordance with the arrival minimum altitudes. The aircraft began descending below the required height, much too soon because the first officer instead chose to fly 1,000 feet in the open beach. Fortunately, the captain instantly saw his mistake and instructed him to immediately ascend back up to 4,300 feet again. He neglected to inform the captain of this mode change, which is a major violation of protocol, particularly when flying in hilly terrain. Their minimum fall altitude on the VOR approach was 1,000 feet, rounded up from 970 feet. We are unsure of the reason for this error, but it's probable that the first officer, who was a little anxious about the upcoming steep offset approach, just made a mistake. It wouldn't be the final one either. Given that Ulia Sella Tango, the actual descending site, was less than 3 nautical miles away at the time of the incident, this interruption would have probably increased the first officer's workload and maybe affected subsequent events. The first officer anticipated that the plane would finally be allowed to begin descending towards the airport as it passed Ulia Sella Tango. The mental image he now had for the upcoming approach would have included all of the numerous additional configurations that also needed to be made. However, something utterly perplexing occurred here. Abruptly, the plane began to turn to the left. Naturally, the path entered into the flight management computer caused it to do so, although the original pilot did not want that to occur. In order to manually regulate the direction and maintain the aircraft's straight trajectory, he immediately pressed the heading track button. He also swiftly started the fall towards 1,200 feet. After noticing the first officer's previous altitude error, the captain instructed him to let the aircraft finish the entire procedural turn. He probably believed that even though it would be annoying, a turn wouldn't be a catastrophe because, in his opinion, they had already departed from the approach radial at this point. Once they returned to the NDB following the turn, they could simply begin to approach. He somehow failed to see that the first cop had begun to descend as well. For very good reason. Keep in mind that the minimum altitude required to pass the Juliet Sierra Tango NDB inbound on the approach was 4,300 feet. Near the approach track, there were a number of tall mountains, including one that rose to a height of 3,152 feet. The captain just rotated the heading bug around himself and then re-engaged the lateral navigation, rather than letting the first officer, who was still pilot flying, handle the turn. The first officer was also lowering the drop rate from 1,100 feet per minute to 700 feet per minute at the same time. Just a quick reminder that having both pilots input on the flying controls or the mode control panel at the same time is never a good idea. It's crucial that we stay within our assigned responsibilities to prevent confusion about who is in charge. This is particularly crucial when the first officer is piloting because the captain taking over can cause the first officer to lose all initiative and situational awareness. At this point, the two pilots had rather different ideas on how to handle their current predicament. The first officer had planned to just continue inbound manually, so he began to descend. The captain wanted to finish the maneuver while keeping 4,300 feet till over the Juliet Sierra Tango again. This resulted in the worst possible combination of those two plans. The plane was just 2,200 feet high and was heading 158 degrees to rejoin the hike into Juliet Sierra Tango, but it also meant that a massive mountain 1,000 feet above them suddenly stood in their way. The captain must have abruptly realized that the plane was losing altitude at this point, so he cried out, "Why are we descending?" and instructed the first officer to circle and turn left right away. By this time, however, they had dropped considerably lower to 1,880 feet, and were so near the mountain that the upgraded ground proximity warning system began to sound its alarm. The terrain escape maneuver is a very obvious process that needs to be followed right away and without hesitation when that signal is heard. Turning off the outer pilot, pitching, pulling to full back stick, thrust levers, full toga, speed brakes, checking down and bank, and adjusting the wings are all examples of this maneuver in an Airbus. The pilot flying must complete these tasks instantly from memory, and the pilot monitoring must ensure that everything is done correctly in order to track the aircraft's performance and identify any terrain-related peculiarities. Instead, the first officer responded by turning on the autopilot in full ascent when the captain commanded him to circle around and climb, even though the autopilot should have been turned off right away in this situation. Then, using their respective side sticks, the pilots began to draw back. However, none of them adjusted the truss levers to the toga detail, so the truss simply continued to climb normally as directed by the outer truss and the autopilot. Once more, adherence to established protocols and roles would have probably caught these errors, but panic was now beginning to spread and communication was further deteriorating as a result. Thus, the truss remained unaltered. The Airbus fly-by-wire technology would now consider both of those inputs when two pilots simultaneously pushed back on their side sticks without anyone gaining precedence. In this instance, this resulted in the aircraft's nose quickly rising to a pitch-up of about 21 degrees. What would happen if the nose attitude was abruptly raised without the full thrust being selected? Indeed, the angle of attack began to increase at the same time that the speed began to decrease. Remember how I told you about the American Airlines Carly disaster earlier, where they were missiled into flying in the direction of a mountain because of an error they made in the FNC. That's a lot like what had happened here. And now that this crew likewise made a mistake with the terrain escape maneuver at first, the parallels are nearly uncanny. However, This is where the pilots finally benefited from decades of technological breakthroughs. Because this crew had the fantastic protections of the Airbus A320 at their disposal in addition to receiving their terrain warnings much sooner than the crew of American Airlines Flight 965. As you can see, the Airbus has many hard protections, which are non-overridable measures implemented by the out-of-flight system to maintain the aircraft inside a safe flying envelope. These safeguards are in place as long as the aircraft is operating in accordance with normal law. One of these safeguards, called alpha floor, comes into play when the aircraft's speed begins to drop below the minimum allowable airspeed while maintaining a high angle of attack. In this instance, a turn away from the terrain, a declining airspeed, and an exceptionally high pitch angle were all contributing factors. One of the things that occurs when this is uttered is that the maximum toga thrust is automatically engaged, and that thrust is then locked in using a device called a toga lock. As the name implies, this function will maintain the thrust output in toga until the outer throttle is disengaged by the crew. Therefore, even though these pilots hadn't set the aircraft at first, it gave them full thrust as they pitched up and turned as the speed decreased. Eventually, they moved the thrust levers into the toga to turn. But by then, the toga lock had already engaged, and their FNA's primary flight displays would have shown it. And this was going to offer them a whole new dilemma in the near future, as we shall see. You see, after transitioning from a potentially controlled flight into a terrain event, where the pilot had at least maintained control of the aircraft, despite losing situational awareness, they began to actually lag behind the aircraft. This meant that the aeroplane was now flying them rather than the pilot. The Nice's approach controller had not received any communication from the crew during this entire incident. Nonetheless, he had last heard from them when they read back their approach clearance. Now, however, they summoned him once more, stating that they had visited. The crew was already well below the go-around height of 4,300 feet when the controller answered and instructed them to maintain it. I fully appreciate that they were prioritizing the terrain escape maneuver and their extremely low weight, which is probably why they overshot that missed approach height. The first officer began lowering the nose in an attempt to level off after they were certain that the terrain was no longer an issue. What do you suppose transpired at that time? Indeed, it made no difference if the crew pulled the thrust levers back. The engines would continue to produce their maximum thrusts until the pilots completely released the outer thrusts, because the outer throttle was still in toga lock. Additionally, it's interesting to note that the Airbus A320 does not have toga lock, but other Airbus models do. In any case, the light aircraft rapidly accelerated due to the high thrust, reaching an incredible 331 knots, just 19 knots short of the aircraft's maximum approved speed. The pilots eventually disengaged the outer thrusts at about 6,500 feet, got the speed under control, and leveled off about 30 seconds later. This allowed them to reach a maximum altitude of 7,640 feet, which was 3,340 feet above the cleared altitude and 81 knots faster than the top speed permitted in this airspace. This is an excellent example of how things can easily spiral out of control when one mistake leads to another and tight cockpit discipline is not followed. Even though fortunately there were no other aircraft in the sky, so there was no traffic conflict. Personally, I also consider the issues with Airbus' proposal to forego self-moving thrust levels and active side sticks to provide pilots with tactile cues of what's happening at this time. Even though the toga lock was enunciated on their flight mode annunciator, it took a while for the pilots to realize it in this instance, as both pilots were simultaneously inputting controls. This would have been evident if the thrust lever had actually indicated what the thrust was doing. However, I will still record this as a victory for the future because the amazing toga lock and alpha floor protection most likely saved their bacon during the escape maneuver. The safety systems of Airbus. The pilots returned to the published missed approach technique and lowered themselves back to 4,300 feet when the situation had somewhat subsided. This was followed by another procedural approach, which this time resulted in a successful landing with no additional difficulties. However, I imagine that the unfortunate cabin crew member wearing the jumpsuit had a few more gray hairs and a few stories to share with her colleagues following this. It took a few days for the authorities to grasp how severe this incident was, even though the crew had clearly reported it. This tale is based on flight data recordings, interviews, and other retrievable material because the cockpit voice recorder had already been lost at that point. According to the investigation, the pilots improperly performed re-cleared arrival route, which they had not been briefed, was the cause of the catastrophe. They then made a mistaken descent straight into the terrain, which was followed by a poorly performed terrain escape technique and ensuing level and speed breaches. The pilots' poor work distribution and communication were the main causes of all of this, which resulted in a loss of situation awareness as the disaster got worse. Furthermore, the weather, the aircraft's lightweight, and perhaps some distractions from having another person in the cockpit all contributed to the pilot's inability to always understand what the automatics were doing. However, I believe that the startle effect's evident beginning was overlooked in this instance. That's what occurs when something truly unexpected occurs, which rapidly increases stress levels and frequently causes us to pause for a few seconds before acting. And when we do, it's crucial that we adhere to established protocols because failure to do so can result in errors like this one. Since it is often extremely clear that we are preparing a crew for a terrain escape maneuver, for example, it is very difficult to train startle response, especially in the simulator. As a result, real startles are frequently experienced for the first time in a real-world scenario. For this reason, rigorous cockpit discipline, extensive technical knowledge, and thorough procedure training are crucial. Wizz now took this incident seriously and re-examined their training curriculum with reference to non-precision approaches, terrain escape maneuvers, and adherence to cockpit duties. To ensure that everyone could learn from the incident, information about it was subsequently distributed to all of the company's pilots. Pilots who participated were given further training before being permitted to return to the crew. And that's precisely how this sector maintains this level of safety. We are all human, so mistakes will be made, but as long as there is openness and honesty, they shouldn't result in disciplinary action. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe. Stay safe and see you in the next one.